I knew something was off the second I saw the tire tracks. It was late Saturday afternoon, and I'd driven 2 hours up into the wooded ridge where my cabin was still under construction. I'd bought the land last fall, 10 acres of peace and quiet just outside the small town of Pine Hollow. The structure was halfway done, no windows yet, just the frame and roof. No plumbing, no electricity. Still, it was mine. My name's Mason Albury, and I'd worked every weekend to build that place with my own hands, so imagine my confusion when I pulled up and saw a dozen cars parked in the clearing. I killed the engine and stepped out. The thump of bass echoed from inside my unfinished cabin. I could hear people laughing. Someone was yelling, "Shots, shots, shots!" Then a glass bottle shattered. I took a long breath, trying not to explode. I wasn't even in the HOA neighborhood right now. This was outside their jurisdiction. Or so I thought. Then I saw her, Tina Merriweather, blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, pink linen blouse, president of the Pine Hollow Bluffs HOA. She was standing on my porch, what would eventually be my porch, holding a red Solo cup and barking orders at some poor teenager hauling in a folding table. I marched up the hill. "Tina," I said, stopping a few feet away. She turned like she'd spotted a raccoon in her kitchen. "Oh, Mason. Didn't expect you to be here. Isn't this place adorable? We decided it'd be perfect for the HOA's spring social." "You what?" "Well," she said, laughing like I was the crazy one. "You weren't using it. And technically, per Section 8 of the Extended Community Covenants, this is outside the HOA. Tina waved a hand. "Well, it's adjacent. It's private property, Tina." She took a sip from her cup. "Don't be dramatic. We cleaned up some of your tools. Honestly, it was a hazard. And we brought chairs and decorations. You should be thanking us." I walked past her into the cabin. My saw was gone. My level 2, someone had hung string lights from my exposed rafters. There were beer coolers on my subfloor. I spotted a guy peeing off the back corner of the deck. That was it. I walked straight back to my truck, locked the doors, and called the sheriff. 30 minutes later, Deputy Callahan pulled up in his cruiser, lights flashing. Tina approached him like she was welcoming a guest to her wine tasting. "Oh, officer, I'm so glad you're here." "Mason's being very aggressive." Deputy Callahan turned to me. "She says she's the president of the HOA." "She is," I said. "But this isn't HOA land. This is my cabin. I've got the deed in the glove box." I handed it over. "Okay," the deputy said, flipping through the paperwork. Then he looked at Tina. "Ma'am, did you organize this event on his property without permission?" Tina blinked, adjusting her sunglasses. "Well, I mean he wasn't using it. And the HOA had a vote. You had a vote to trespass?" "Don't be ridiculous," she said, but her voice was starting to crack. I walked back inside and started pointing. "That cooler, not mine. That sound system, not mine. That guy throwing up in the fire pit, definitely not mine." Callahan gave one sharp whistle. "Party's over, everyone out." "Now?" Tina was still trying to argue, but the look on the deputy's face shut her down. One by one, the board members and their guests filtered out, muttering and glaring at me like I had ruined their day. As the last car pulled away, Deputy Callahan turned to me. "You want to press charges?" "Oh, I do," I said. "Every last one of them." By Monday morning, the whole town was buzzing. Pine Hollow wasn't exactly a metropolis, the kind of place where a single siren could start a dozen phone trees. And the sight of a sheriff clearing out wine-drunk board members from someone's half-built cabin had spread faster than gossip at the diner. I spent the better part of Sunday surveying the damage. My circular saw had been shoved into a pile of folding chairs behind a tree. Someone had used my unopened box of insulation rolls as seating. Even worse, I found a cracked joist where someone had leaned a grill against the support beam and let the heat warp the lumber. It wasn't just disrespect, it was structural. Late that night, I flipped through the security footage from the trail cameras I'd mounted around the perimeter. They were mostly for deer and the occasional trespassing teenager, but this time they'd captured something far more useful. Tina unlocking the temporary construction lockbox with a key she absolutely should not have had. I paused the frame. She looked directly at the camera. I drove into town the next morning to speak with Sheriff Redmond himself. She used a key, I said, placing the printed stills on the desk between us. That lockbox came from the hardware store a week ago. I've had the only combo. Redmond leaned back in his chair, studying the image closely. You're telling me she duplicated a contractor's key and accessed your private property without consent? Yes, and she wasn't alone. Look at this. I slid over another photo, time-stamped and clear. That's Mark Ellis. He's vice president of the HOA. He's holding bolt cutters. Redmond's brow furrowed. You're saying they broke into your tool shed? Not saying. Showing. He tapped his pen against the desk. Technically, this crosses into criminal trespass, possibly breaking and entering. And if they damaged your property, we're looking at destruction of private assets. They threw a party on an active construction site. That's a liability nightmare. The sheriff nodded slowly. I'll need to speak with the district attorney. By Tuesday, subpoenas were quietly issued. Tina, Mark, and 2 other board members were called in for questioning. I didn't hear the details, but I saw them leaving the courthouse that afternoon, none of them talking to each other. Mark's shirt was untucked. Tina looked like she hadn't slept. That evening, I got a call from a guy named Julian Davis. He was a civil attorney working out of a small office near the county courthouse. He'd heard through a mutual acquaintance that I'd had a run-in with the HOA. I've represented a few clients against Pine Hollow Bluffs, he said. You wouldn't believe how many times they've overstepped. They think their bylaws override state law. I met with Julian the next morning, bringing along my deed, the photos, and a copy of the HOA's charter. He flipped through the documents like he already knew what he'd find. They've been trying to expand their jurisdiction for years, he muttered, shaking his head. You're lucky you caught them early. Most folks don't realize what's happening until liens show up on their title records. I leaned forward. They tried to tell the sheriff they had authority here. Called it adjacent property enforcement. Julian laughed once bitterly. That's not a thing. They made it up. He pointed to a clause in the charter. See this. They're only authorized to operate within the original subdivision boundaries. Anything outside that perimeter is explicitly excluded. Then how did they get in? Julian sat back. I'd bet anything they've been entering lots like yours under the radar. You're just the first one to push back hard enough. That afternoon, I filed a formal complaint with the county zoning board. Turns out, the HOA had submitted a request 6 weeks earlier to informally integrate surrounding parcels into their oversight area. The request had been denied. They'd held the party anyway. By Thursday, the county's legal liaison sent me an email. They were opening a broader investigation into the HOA's expansion attempts, including allegations of falsified votes on annexation and unauthorized entry into multiple private lots. Friday morning, I got a knock on my door. It was Gregor Tannies, a retired postal worker who lived in the original subdivision. You're the guy with the cabin, right? He asked. I nodded. I was on the board 10 years ago, he said, adjusting his cap, before Tina took over. Back then, things were simple. We took care of the sidewalks, made sure the pool was clean. Now, she's hiring surveyors and rewriting parcel maps like she's building an empire. Did you know they tried to annex my land? He scratched his beard. They've been pushing that angle for months. Said it would increase overall neighborhood cohesion. I thought it sounded fishy. I invited him in. We sat at my workbench and went over the footage and documents together. He added names to the faces I didn't recognize, including a man named Sheldon Cray, the treasurer, who apparently had a habit of misplacing HOA funds. By the weekend, I had a full timeline. Trail cam timestamps, board meeting minutes, which Gregor still had copies of, and a paper trail showing illegal use of HOA funds for community events that had taken place off HOA property, including mine. Julian filed a civil suit on my behalf Monday morning. The charges included trespassing, property damage, unlawful entry, and intentional misrepresentation of governance authority. but we weren't the only ones filing. 3 other property owners came forward, each with similar stories. Tools moved without consent, unauthorized landscaping, even construction debris dumped on their lots. 2 of them had been too intimidated to speak up. Tina had apparently threatened fines for non-compliance, even though they lived outside her jurisdiction. The sheriff's office issued a search warrant for the HOA's storage unit. Inside, they found dozens of file boxes filled with altered maps, fake vote records, and internal memos referring to territorial expansion initiatives. Some were signed by Tina, others by Mark. A few were in Sheldon's handwriting, referencing financial reallocations from the maintenance fund to community integration efforts. The district attorney didn't hesitate. By Thursday, formal charges were filed against Tina, Mark, Sheldon, and the HOA's secretary for conspiracy to commit fraud, misuse of funds, and criminal trespass. I sat in the back row of the courtroom during their arraignment. Tina didn't make eye contact. Mark's lawyer asked for a delay, citing unexpected complications. Sheldon looked like he'd just watched his retirement disappear. Outside the courthouse, a small group of homeowners had gathered. Some held handmade signs. One read, "Not my president." Another said, "We want our pool dues back." A reporter from the local news station approached me while I was walking to my truck. "You're the guy with the cabin, right?" "That's me." "Any comment on today's hearing?" I paused. "Yeah. Next time someone wants to throw a party on my land, they can try asking first," she laughed. "Fair enough." That night, I drove back up to the cabin with a new padlock, reinforced the joist that had been damaged, and installed 2 more cameras. I wasn't taking chances. But I didn't feel angry anymore, just focused. They'd tried to turn my land into a playground for their power trip. Now, they'd be lucky if they were allowed to organize a bake sale, and I was just getting started. The courtroom was quieter than usual the following Monday, as the county announced it would be holding a public audit of the Pine Hollow Bluffs Homeowners Association. The announcement came after the district attorney's office received a sealed envelope containing what they referred to as financial irregularities spanning multiple fiscal years. The envelope hadn't come from me. It came from someone inside the HOA. Julian and I sat in the second row, just behind the press. The county commissioner read through the list of alleged violations, his voice steady but dry, like he was reading grocery prices. Unauthorized use of community funds for private contractor services. Unreported income from event vendors. Misrepresented property lines in submitted annexation requests. Each line drew a reaction from the crowd. Low murmurs rippled through the room. A woman in a blue cardigan leaned over and whispered something to her husband, who shook his head in disbelief. Tina sat with her arms folded, lips pressed into a hard line. She'd swapped her usual pastel blazer for a muted gray jacket as if dressing down might somehow lessen the weight of the scandal. Julian nudged my elbow. "See the guy in the front row?" he whispered. "That's Victor Hanley. He's the county's forensic auditor. If he's here in person, they're taking this seriously." After the hearing, I stepped out into the hall just as a man approached from the other end. Mid-50s, windbreaker, clipboard in hand. He stopped in front of me and flipped through a stack of forms. "You're Mason Albury." "That's right." "Name's Clay Renshaw. I'm with County Property Standards. We've had some complaints about unauthorized road grading and soil dumping on parcels near your lot. Your name came up because you filed the original boundary challenge. I haven't touched anything outside my build site." "That's what I figured. But the thing is," he said, pulling out a photo, "this gravel pad here, that wasn't there during our last aerial survey. It's on the parcel south of yours. Belongs to a woman named Miriam Docks." I stared at the image. I recognized the tree line. The gravel looked fresh. And I'd seen a crew working there a few weekends ago wearing neon vests with HOA grounds printed on the back. "That's not mine," I said. "They've been doing that without telling the landowners?" "Looks like it." We've got 3 other complaints just like this one, all within a mile radius of the original subdivision. Julian stepped up beside me. You think the HOA's been using dues to make improvements on land they don't control? Renshaw nodded. Or worse, trying to inflate the neighborhood's footprint to justify a reassessment. More homes under their umbrella, more annual fees. I turned to Julian. That's fraud, right? At this scale, he said. It's more than that. It's racketeering. That word hung in the air like smoke. We left the courthouse and drove straight to Miriam Dox's property. She was outside, tending to a row of potted herbs on her porch when we pulled up. Her house was weathered but well kept, the kind of place with wind chimes and a welcome mat that actually felt sincere. Is this about the gravel? She asked before we even reached the steps. You've seen it too, I asked. They showed up 2 Saturdays ago. Said they were staging materials for community beautification. I told them to leave. Next thing I know, I've got a parking area I didn't ask for. Did they give you any paperwork? Julian asked. Just a flyer with the HOA logo. Said it was part of a land use harmonization initiative, whatever that means. It meant they were laying the groundwork for a hostile annexation. Paving driveways, planting shrubs, cleaning up trails, all things they could later point to and claim as evidence of shared infrastructure. Julian took a few photos, then handed her a business card. You might want to consider becoming a plaintiff. Later that evening, I met with Gregor again. He'd brought a box of old meeting records dating back over 15 years. In one of them, buried among the budget notes, was a name I hadn't seen before, North Fork Planning Solutions. What's this? I asked. Consulting firm they hired back in the day, Gregor replied. Supposed to help with long-term development goals. But they stopped mentioning them after Tina took over. I looked up the firm. It had been dissolved 7 years ago, but its former director, a man named Everett Cray, Sheldon's uncle. I handed the file to Julian the next morning, and by noon he'd tracked down a paper trail. The HOA had paid North Fork nearly $40,000 over 2 years, most of it in checks signed by Sheldon. The firm had done no visible work, no reports, no surveys, nothing. Julian called the district attorney again. Now we've got embezzlement, he said after hanging up. They funneled money through a shell firm owned by a board member's relative. We weren't the only ones digging. The local news had started running nightly segments, spotlighting residents who'd been fined for things like non-standard mailbox shape or overly rustic window shutters. One woman had been charged a monthly fee for excessive bird bath activity. Turned out, Tina had written that policy herself, citing concerns about avian overpopulation. The absurdity of it all finally tipped public opinion. Homeowners who'd once been silent started organizing. A town hall was scheduled. It wasn't hosted by the board, it was demanded by the residents. The night of the meeting, the community center overflowed. Folding chairs lined every wall. People stood shoulder to shoulder, some holding receipts, others waving violation notices printed on pink paper. A retired teacher read aloud a letter from her lawyer, stating that the HOA had attempted to levy a lien against her home without legal standing. Tina stepped up to the microphone, flanked by the 3 remaining board members. Her voice was tight, almost forced. We understand there have been concerns about recent initiatives. Let me assure you, everything was done with the intention of improving our shared quality of life. A man in the back shouted, "Then why are you being audited?" Another voice followed. "Why'd you dump gravel on my land?" Tina tried to stay composed. "We followed community procedures." All actions were approved through board consensus. "No, they weren't," said a woman near the front. She held up a binder. "I was on the board. You cut us out of votes and held private meetings at your house." The room erupted. Someone banged a fist on the table. Another called for a vote of no confidence. Tina tried to speak again, but her microphone was cut. The moderator, a city official brought in to oversee the meeting, calmly stepped forward. Given the volume and severity of the complaints, The county will be freezing all HOA discretionary spending pending the outcome of the investigation. The crowd applauded. Tina stepped down, her face pale. She exited through a side door, avoiding the cameras waiting out front. Within the week, the board formally resigned, citing personal reasons. The county appointed an interim stewardship committee made up of residents with no past ties to the leadership. One of them was Miriam. I received a handwritten note a few days later. Mason, thank you for standing your ground. If you ever need help finishing that cabin, let me know. I've got a cousin who does roofing. I pinned it to the wall inside the cabin, right above where the kitchen window would be. A few nights later, I sat on the porch well, the framed-in platform where the porch would be watching the sun drop behind the ridge. The lights of town flickered in the distance, peaceful. Still, that's what I'd come here for, and now it was finally mine again. The following week brought a shift in the air, like the town had finally woken up from a long spell. With the old board dissolved, the HOA offices were locked pending forensic review, and all community enforcement had been suspended. But the real explosion came when the sheriff's department, armed with the findings from the county auditors, executed a new warrant, this time not just for records, but for personal devices and home offices. The charges weren't just sticking, they were multiplying. Julian and I met again inside the old post office turned cafe, where the booth still carried the scent of old varnish and pine cleaner. He brought a manila folder thick enough to make the table creak. They were running a shadow fund, he said, sliding the folder over. Set up a dummy community improvement account under a name just different enough to avoid detection. Most of the board didn't even know it existed. Tina and Sheldon funneled over 90,000 through it. I opened it to find spreadsheets, email printouts, and a wire transfer log leading to a private contractor in another state. They hired a private security firm, Julian continued. Not for neighborhood patrols, this was a firm that specializes in land acquisition enforcement. Out of state, no permits. They were preparing to forcibly remove structures on properties they rezoned in their own fake maps. I looked up. You're telling me they were planning to evict people from their land? Not just planning. They filed mock notices. I got a hold of one from a family down near the southern ridge. HOA stationary. Claimed their home was non-compliant with updated residential integration standards. Gave them 30 days to vacate. Was it real, legally? Not even close. But they were counting on fear, not law. And they almost pulled it off. The sheriff's department had begun interviewing displaced residents from properties adjacent to the HOA's boundaries, many of whom had moved out quietly after receiving notices they assumed were legitimate. Some had sold their land under pressure, others had simply walked away, believing they'd lost a zoning battle they never had a chance to fight. The worst part, those lots were now registered under shell companies. And every single one traced back to a trust fund that listed Sheldon Cray as its executor. Julian leaned forward. They weren't just throwing parties on your land, that was the tip of it. They were building an empire, quietly, illegally. I exhaled through my nose. How many families? 7 so far, maybe more. Some of them didn't even know they'd been conned. They just thought the county took their land. That afternoon, the sheriff's department held a press briefing outside the courthouse. Deputy Callahan read the charges off a single sheet of paper. The crowd stood still, every camera and phone aimed his way. Multiple counts of fraud, criminal conspiracy, wire fraud, real estate coercion under false pretenses, and unlawful private security contracting. Additional charges pending. Reporters fired off questions. One asked if any of the board members had attempted to flee. Callahan answered calmly. Tina Merriweather attempted to board a private flight from a regional airstrip. She's currently in custody. The news hit town like a thunderclap. Tina's arrest photo was on the front page of the next morning's Pine Hollow Register, her signature sunglasses replaced with a booking number. Sheldon had been picked up at her rental cabin 2 counties over. Mark Ellis turned himself in after one of the victims filed a civil suit detailing how he'd personally delivered falsified notices. The most damning testimony came not from a victim, but from someone on the inside. Laura Kent, the former secretary who'd resigned 2 months before the initial party at my cabin. Julian and I met her in a neutral location, at her roadside diner just off the county highway. She wore a heavy coat, even though it was warm out, and glanced over her shoulder twice before sitting. "They were rewriting maps," she said quietly. "Not just editing, creating entire overlays. Tina had a guy scan old plat maps and digitally alter the boundaries. They paid him in cash and gift cards. What were they planning to do with them? File them during the next zoning session, slip them in as updated records. County wouldn't have caught it unless someone cross-referenced the originals." Julian sat back. "You kept copies?" Laura handed over a flash drive. "I backed up everything before I left. I didn't know what they were planning exactly, but I knew it was bad." The drive contained audio recordings of internal meetings. Tina's voice was unmistakable. "We get the lots under the trust's name, we push through the updated zoning, and then we start development. Vacation rentals, maybe a community center. If the owners fight, we hit them with non-compliance notices. Most won't bother hiring lawyers." Julian closed his laptop. "That's conspiracy to defraud on a county level. This isn't just a civil case anymore." The state attorney general's office got involved within days. A special investigative unit arrived in Pine Hollow with a mobile command trailer and began interviewing witnesses. Charges expanded to include forgery, identity misrepresentation, and obstruction of public records. Gregor stopped by my cabin the next morning, holding a thermos and a folder. "You're going to want to see this," he said, handing it over. Inside was a list of names. Every homeowner in the original HOA who had received a fine, a lien, or a complaint under Tina's administration. Next to each name was a dollar amount. Some were in the hundreds, others in the thousands. "Sheldon kept a second ledger," Gregor said. "He was inflating the amounts, then skimming the difference into the trust fund." "Any idea how much total?" "Almost 200,000. The county froze all HOA accounts and began issuing restitution notices. Homeowners who had been fined under the false policies were eligible for reimbursement. Those who had been forced to sell were contacted directly by the state's legal aid division. The following town council meeting was held outdoors to accommodate the crowd. A folding table served as the dais, and a former judge volunteered to act as interim moderator. Residents lined up to speak, each given 3 minutes. A contractor who had been fined for inappropriate fence texture explained how he'd nearly lost his business. A single mother shared how she'd moved out after being told her swing set violated yard uniformity guidelines. By the end of the night, nearly every speaker had proposed the same thing: dissolve the HOA completely. The motion passed unanimously. Pine Hollow Bluffs HOA was officially disbanded. The community agreed to form a voluntary neighborhood council for shared maintenance, with no authority over private property. The remaining funds in the HOA account would be used for infrastructure repairs managed by an independent treasurer elected by residents. I received a letter from the state's attorney office 2 weeks later. My civil case had been resolved. The defendants had agreed to a settlement, including full restitution for damages to my cabin, legal fees, and a public written apology. It arrived in a plain envelope. Tina's signature was at the bottom. It read more like a court-mandated surrender than an actual apology. I framed it anyway, not out of pride, out of principle. Later that month, I stood on the newly finished porch of my cabin. The roof was done, the windows were in, and the deck overlooked the ridge where the town shimmered in the twilight. A few neighbors stopped by with folding chairs and coolers, not to throw a party, but to help celebrate the end of an era. Miriam brought a pie. Gregor brought a battered guitar. Someone started a fire in the pit I'd built myself, and for the first time since breaking ground, the place felt like home, Julian showed up just before sundown. He handed me a sealed envelope. "What's this?" "Final court filings." "Case closed." I placed it on the railing and looked out over the trees. No more fake fines, no more forced compliance, just land and people who respect it, he nodded. "And no one's gonna show up uninvited again." I looked down at the trail camera mounted near the edge of the porch. "No," I said, "they won't."